basic forecast by the Bank of Russia. Our today's decision is based on the profound revision of our view of economic development and inflation trends in the next 3 years. Since the last Board of Directors revision of the key rate, 3 events have happened which have defined our view of the situation. They are primarily associated with the spread of the coronavirus pandemic. Firstly, this is a drastic decline in the global economy. Secondly, there has been another round of a slump in oil prices despite the new OPEC Plus deal. Thirdly, this is the government which has introduced nationwide restrictions. As a result, a large number of businesses have suspended their operations or switched to the remote work mode. Their employees, a lot of citizens, are currently in self-isolation. As to positive factors, I would focus on a slight stabilization in global financial markets as compared to March, which was largely driven by measures being implemented by the central banks of reserve currency countries. Therefore, given all the developments, we have completely reviewed our economic forecast. Our today's decision relies exactly on the forecast and not on the latest statistics we are receiving. The statistics still show the previous month's situation and cannot provide a clear view to estimate further trends. Building our forecast, we were rather taking into account leading indicators of the economic situation, including data on electric power consumption, financial flows, household spending, as well as the experience of other countries where the pandemic has been spreading for a longer period. I will now dwell on the main assumptions behind our baseline forecast. Our forecast relies on a conservative view of oil prices, especially in 2020. We assume that they will be slowly growing from the average level of $15 per barrel in the second quarter to $25 per barrel in the fourth quarter. There are large oil stocks accumulated with a downfall in global demand. This will limit the recovery of oil prices even if the new OPEC Plus agreement is fully complied with. Further on, oil prices are expected to gradually rise to $45 per barrel in 2022 as global demand picks up and oil stock levels decrease. Another key assumption of our forecast is the duration of the coronavirus pandemic and the restrictions implemented in Russia and abroad. Our estimates suggest that governments will be gradually lifting considerably easing the majority of current restrictions in the second quarter. In this case, we can expect that in the third and fourth quarters, economic activity will be recovering quarter on quarter. The economic situation will be returning to normal step by step. The direct adverse impact of the restrictions primarily falls on this quarter, while their secondary effects will continue to manifest in the future. According to our surveys, over 80% of the businesses across various industries have been experiencing the influence of the coronavirus pandemic and current restrictions. Companies' business sentiment has materially declined. It will take time to restore business processes. Logistics and production chains offset the reduction in profit and revenue, build up reserves and savings that have been used to a greater or lesser extent over the second quarter. Combined with uncertainty regarding potential changes in the external environment, this will limit production, investment, and consumer activity. In these conditions, GDP will shrink year on year in the third and fourth quarter. That is, the annual rate of economic growth will be negative. According to the Bank of Russia's forecast, GDP will overall decrease by 4 to 6% in 2020. The major contributor to this reduction will be a decline in exports that may reach from 10 to 15%. Moreover, fixed capital investment will also substantially decrease by 6 to 10% compared to the previous year. Companies will primarily using their financial resources to restore their daily operations. Uncertainty about the prospects of domestic and external demand will be confining investment plans. The decline in production and investments will be confining the opportunities for an upturn in income. Consumer demand will be shrinking. The measures implemented by the government and the Bank of Russia will support the economy and specifically the most affected industries. Economic growth in 2021-22 will largely be recovery type. According to our forecast, GDP will expand by 3 to 5% in 21 and by 1.5 to 3.5 in 2022. GDP growth will be promoted by further implementation of national projects. However, our baseline forecast factors in only the already affected budget support measures. An upturn in the economy and domestic demand will also be driven by the easing of monetary conditions resulting from the monetary policy pursued. This will support lending, and its growth rate will rise from 3-8% this year to 6 to 11% in 2021-22. The lending potential will also be maintained owing to the regulatory easing and the expansion of the Bank of Russia's specialized refinancing instruments. According to our estimates, the easing of monetary policy is needed to maintain annual inflation close to 4% over the forecast horizon. The slump in domestic and external demand this year will be considerably containing inflation, which induces the risk of its substantial deviation downwards from the target in 2021 and over a medium-term horizon if no additional monetary policy measures are introduced. The disinflationary pressure of weak demand will offset the effect of temporary pro-inflationary factors, that is, the ruble weakening and the observed elevated demand for individual products already this year. We believe that a rise in inflation expectations caused by the above factors will also be temporary. We expect that the impact of limited demand on inflation will be stable and long-lasting. Given the transmission lag of monetary policy, we should take actions already now. Based on our forecast, annual inflation will reach 3.8 to 4.8% by the end of the year, amid the easing of monetary policy, and will further on stabilize close to 4%. Moreover, we expect a reversal of inflation trends in the middle of the year. Monthly inflation in annualized terms will begin to go down, while annual inflation will still continue to rise. As to the balance of payments, we expect that the current account balance will decline to negative values in 2020 and 2021 to 35 and 18 billion US dollars respectively. This will mainly result from the slump in exports caused by the reduction in external demand and in export revenues, primarily from oil sales. I would like to point that the temporary switch to a current account deficit is an expected effect produced by the considerable oil price downturn under the influence of the fiscal rule. Receipts from fiscal rule-based foreign currency sales make it possible to support the economy and domestic consumption. In this situation, imports are contracting to a lower degree compared to exports driven by the decline in oil prices. As a result, the current account balance will drop to negative values. In 2022, when the oil price exceeds the cutoff level, the current account balance will return to positive territory and the accumulation of reserves will be resumed via fiscal rule-based foreign currency purchases. We do not expect a noticeable change in the private sector financial account balance over the forecast horizon. According to our estimates, the private sector financial account deficit will reduce from 18 billion US in 2019 to 15 billion US dollars this year. This is linked to decline in GDP, decrease in economic revenues, as well as less possibilities for borrowing in foreign markets at the end of the first quarter. The start of the second quarter amid intensified volatility and uncertainty. Further ahead, as global markets stabilize, the potential for external borrowings will recover, and this will pass through to a reduction in the private sector financial account deficit to 10 billion US dollars in 2021 to 2022. This baseline scenario, without doubt, has many uncertainty factors. They concern both the duration of the restrictions in Russia and worldwide and the pace of recovery of the global and Russian economies. Besides, new spikes of volatility may occur in global financial and commodity markets. Therefore, in our discussions of the key rate decision and its path, we have a proper regard to the objective of sustaining financial stability. As I noted, the baseline forecast incorporates only the fiscal decisions already made by the government, we assume that further on the situation may require additional decisions to support the economy. This will foster an alleviation of effects of the restrictions for households and businesses, accelerate the return of economic activity to normal, and also mitigate the risks of inflation deviation downwards from the target over the next quarters. In the course of our key rate discussions, we considered modal estimates of the influence of such additional fiscal measures on GDP, inflation, and the monetary policy path. We will certainly consider possible developments in fiscal policy in the Russian and global economies in the course of further adjustments of our baseline scenario. Nonetheless, our current analysis suggests that virtually all possible scenario variants allow for monetary policy easing, including amid a certain additional expansion of fiscal measures designed to support the economy. The Board of Directors proceeds from the existing potential for cutting the key rate and discussed possible options at the current and next meetings. The discussion concluded that given such extraordinary developments, it may not prove sufficient to adjust our policy by employing the small step method we used. To return inflation to the target and stabilize the situation in the economy, we may need to implement more decisive measures. At our today's meeting, we have decided to cut the key rate by 50 basis points to 5.5% per annum. We continue to see the potential for the further easing of monetary policy at our next meetings. I would also like to note that given the key rate change, we have decided to cut from 4 to 3.5% per annum the interest rate under the new Bank of Russia's SME lending support facility introduced several weeks ago. We believe this will help to additionally improve the affordability of loans for small and medium-sized enterprises, which were affected the most by the hardships. And a few words in conclusion. The current situation specifically requires timely and even forward-looking decisions so that we are able not only to curb negative trends in the economy, but also to set grounds for a faster normalization of the economic situation after the withdrawal of the restrictions. This will influence both inflation dynamics and the economy recovery path. Therefore, the Bank of Russia is monitoring the effects of its earlier decisions promptly and on an ongoing basis and stands ready to take further steps both in the monetary policy sphere and in the areas of its activity. Thank you very much. And now, let us go over to the questions. Please, Anastasia Saprikina from RIA Novosti. In the press release, it said that the GDP will decline in the second quarter of the current year. How deep may be this decline in the second quarter? May it reach two-digit numbers? At one of the previous press conferences, you mentioned that it would be possible to avoid recession this year. Do you sustain this expectation? Indeed, in our baseline forecast, we view that the main GDP decline, the main impact will take place in the second quarter. Our current estimate is that in the second quarter, GDP may go down to 8%, but afterwards, there will be a gradual economic recovery. Therefore, third quarter will be better than the second one, the fourth better than the third, but nevertheless, the rebounding of economy will be a gradual process. Even through the third and the fourth quarter, we won't be able to compensate for the decline that will take place in the second quarter. So throughout the whole year, we expect negative pace of the economic growth. I mentioned the figures previously. And simultaneously, the recession is something that we can truly avoid as long as the third quarter is better than the second one. And this is our base forecast. Next, Alexei Uvarov from Interfax. When quarterly GDP dynamics will be in the positive, what is the reason behind the central banks of Russia optimism in terms of the economic growth in 2021? up to 4.8%. The quarterly pace, if you measure quarter on quarter, and that is our baseline scenario, stems from the fact that in the third quarter we expect to achieve the positive growth rate quarter on quarter. The annual growth rate will remain negative. In 2021, it will be in the positive. I don't believe that this estimate is super optimistic, because in 2021, there will be economic recovery, but nevertheless, it won't allow us to fully compensate for the economic decline in 2020. And so we act on an assumption that indeed, gradually, not immediately, it will be different in different regions. The restrictions will be lifted, but we will specify our forecast as the situation evolves. Indeed, a lot here will depend upon the way epidemiological environment is developing, and respectively, the way the restrictive measures would be working. So many uncertainties, but I already told you what our baseline scenario is. Anna Kaledina, next one from Izvestia newspaper. You've published only the baseline forecast today, but you also mentioned that during the board meeting, all will be considered. What are the oil indicators were put into the pessimistic, optimistic scenarios? What is the probability of specifically the baseline forecast coming true? Well, it is true that we've looked into different options in order to work out our vision of the baseline forecast and what, in way of hypothesis, we could rely upon in the baseline scenario. So we assumed, as a result, to rely upon the conservative oil price trend, a certain economic recovery, and based on that, we formulated our vision. The risk scenario, as we announced previously, we will plan to review it closer to the autumn, because the risk scenario that we used to have is already redundant. So we expect to do it closer to the autumn, but currently we work within the baseline forecast. Dmitry Butrin, Kommersant. Does the Bank of Russia believe within the next 2 years it is realistic for the Russian Federation to enter into stagflation, which is the combination of recession and inflation, markedly above the central bank's target? Against which conditions this scenario could manifest itself? This is the scenario which we believe as the one that won't happen, because the central bank is pursuing the policy of inflationary targeting. We're not going to give up on this, which means that we will hold inflation under control, and we will not allow for any tangible long-term deviation of inflation from the target. So we do not see the risk of stagflation when there is a high inflation and the low economic growth rates. So this scenario we don't believe to be probable. Elena Fabrichная from Reuters. The analysts expect the key rate to go down by additional 100 basis points this year. If this particular path is probable, or do you foresee a further reduction of the key rate? Once again, I shall repeat, we all practically do see the potential for the easing of the monetary policy. It's the question of how quickly and when are we to use this potential. And we believe that there is indeed this potential available for the key rate to go down within, let's say, the 100 basis points. But in many ways, this will be dependent upon the way situation may evolve. And so we believe that this easing potential will be largely effective once we come out of the period of the restrictive measures. Because at this point in time, both the economy and the households are, and many businesses are closed, and people are self-isolating at home, and to stimulate demand when the restrictive measures are working at the level of supply could be less effective than incentivizing and stimulating demand at the point when we start coming out of the restrictive measures. But the need to stimulate growth and demand is definitely there, because we expect aggregate demand to fall down seriously. The next one, Svetlana Yastribova from Vedomosti. To what extent in its macro forecast the central bank assesses the crisis support measures within 2020, by how much it would decline the economy, and how the central bank would adjust its macro forecast along with the expansion of the support measures? Well, a whole set of support measures have been announced by the government in order to help the households and the businesses, and we have already taken into account the already announced measures. We have already taken into account the measures by the government. Undoubtedly, the way they would impact the GDP we will further specify as long as the effectiveness of these measures is assessed. Our current working view is that the already announced measures support the GDP by about 2%. I mean, without these measures, the GDP decline would have been more pronounced. And without doubt, we will be ready to adjust our macro forecast as these measures are expanded. We adjust our macro forecast every time by our core meeting, and we will be ready to do that by June. Bloomberg. Global rates considerably go down. The central bank also is easing its policy. Will the central bank review the range of the neutral rate in between 6 to 7% down to 5-6%? Is this the new reality? Well, let me remind us once again that the neutral rate is the rate not visible. It can only be assessed in an approximate way, and there are certain factors definitely which are expected to bring us towards reducing this rate, because the global rates are at a much lower level than everybody expected. But at the same time, we do see that the risk premium, amongst other things, for the emerging markets is growing, and therefore there are many uncertainties, and we do not believe it is necessary right now to review our opinion of the neutral rate. We remain within our previous opinion. But once again, I shall underscore that our vision of the neutral rate is not an obstacle to us going forward with our monetary policy easing, because we can pursue a much softer policy once our key rate is below our expectation of what the neutral range is. That is currently happening, and that is why we're saying that we are moving into the range of the softer monetary policy. And I believe that in as far as the neutral rate is concerned, we will take a much more detailed look into it once we discuss the basic components of the monetary policy, because that is where we take a look at the more fundamental factors, and closer to the autumn we will really be having a substantive discussion. Margarita from TASS, Spilevskaya. Central Bank over the past few years have considerably grown its currency sales in the domestic market. What is the reason behind this dynamic? You know that our amount of currency sales depends upon the oil price as part of the fiscal rule, and changing the sales volumes is related to the oil price dynamics. Roman Markelov, Rossiyskaya Gazette. Do you believe that following today's reduction of the key rate, the banks will reduce the rates on the deposits as it usually happens, or in the current economic environment they may defer this decision and not lower their rates at all? Our decision in terms of the key rate is always generating effects with a bit of a lag, reflecting itself upon the banking rates, both in terms of the deposits and loans. This whole transmission mechanism may alter because it is indeed is currently being impacted by this very unconventional environment, and the banks themselves will be deciding what should be the way for them to reflect it in their lending and deposit rates. In the meantime, what we see, despite the fact that the credit risks have strengthened, but the lending rates are not really growing strong, and the deposit rates, despite certain changes, remain quite stable. And apart from it, I would like to say that within the deposit structure, there is quite a big share remaining of the relatively long-term rates linked to the annual deposits. And at the same time, we continue to acknowledge that the deposit rates remain to be attractive for household savings. Yevgeny Belyakov, the Komsomolskaya Pravda. The reduction of the key rate for the economy is a good signal, but as is known, it generates a bit of an impact in terms of its effect up to 6 months, meaning to say that the economy will feel it only in 6 months' time. But help is needed now. Maybe it is worthwhile on top of the reducing the lending rates that in the crisis time very few would go to use direct financial support to businesses and households, not just dole out money in terms of the loans, but for free, so as to offset the future, lending credit payments. What do you think about it? Let me repeat, we do support direct payment of money to households and businesses in these difficult times from the budget and the transfer instruments, because the loans and the loan rates currently do not bear any significance, because currently for people what's more important is direct support, and we do see that both businesses and households are afraid to increase their credit burden for the future, and the government is applying such support measures, and the fiscal ones, and the grants, and the unemployment support, the payments to the most needy categories of citizens. But I ask you, do not confuse it with the monetary policy. And the so-called, helicopter money, although nobody raised this question, with, printing, of money by the central bank and giving away to the households. First, I would like to say that nobody in the world is using these measures. People are talking about it, but this helicopter, money, when the central banks are printing money and simply just over the counter give it to everyone. But even if you imagine that we, as the central bank, print money and just give it away at a zero rate, what it will lead us to. Let me remind you of 1990s. That would bring us into an eruption of inflation. The people who get these banknotes, they would hardly be able to use it to buy anything, because all of such payments will lose value by price growth. And that is inevitable in such an environment. So our task is to preserve savings and wages and the purchasing power, control over inflation, so that inflation could conform to our targets, which is exactly the thing which enables us to support, once again, the purchasing power of the wages and salaries and people's savings. So direct fiscal payments, yes, but the monetary policy in the first place must make sure that prices do not grow, and that in itself will support the household level of affordability. We can also soften our monetary policy. We mentioned it by reducing the key rate, and we do it not to the detriment of inflation. In such a way we do it so that prices do not grow at a fast pace. Anastasia Stilova, Interfax. As part of this bank acquisition, the National Wealth Fund currency was converted, but it is currently being also sold out into the market with the price goes down below 25. How much of this money central banks has sold it? Has decision was made if it doesn't sell all of it, what it will do until September 30th? Will there be an offsetting of these transactions and the terminated transactions for the acquisition of a hard currency? For how long the FX transactions have been stopped, because the decision was made on March 30th for the duration of 30 days? Anastasia Stilova asked this question. Yes, we have several channels, or rather several channels or mechanisms through which we sell foreign currency. We started in a preemptive way selling hard currency on March 10th. The total accumulated sales of FX, and all of it is part of the fiscal rule mechanisms, including other transactions related to the divestiture from central banks. So the total amount was $5.5 billion. Alongside with that, the regular sales by the Minister of Finance, which started on April 7th, instead of the previous acquisitions of currency when the oil price was above the cutoff price. These regular sales currently amounted to a little bit more than $600 million. So the preemptive sales, which the Bank of Russia did before that, before the Minister of Finance initiated its preemptive sales, we did it in order to compensate for the lag between the current oil price and the Minister of Finance's operations and transactions as part of the fiscal rules, which were linked to the previous prices. So these sales amounted to $2.3 billion. Apart from it, sales as part of the Sberbank shares stock deal where we compensate for the falling out oil and gas exports revenue when the Urals price is less than $25 per barrel, and that was announced on March 19th. So this amount of sales was $2.6 billion US dollars. So that is the structure of our aggregate FX sales, and we will make decisions about the sale of the balance of the FX related to the Sberbank deal, as well as whether it is worthwhile to do any offsetting related to the fact that we terminated the acquisition of FX on behalf of the Ministry of Finance when we started the preemptive sales once the oil price environment is stable. Now, next table, Margarita Shpilevskaya. TASS. The head of the VTB stated that the banks could buy additional bond issues if the repo terms are extended. Is the central bank ready to consider extending the repo term for these purposes? We have already announced, and I shall repeat it again, we do not rule out that the repo period is going to be extended, but not for the above-mentioned transactions, because overall we see that there is a need for a longer-term liquidity in an environment where the banks have their liabilities shortened and their assets extended because of the loan restructuring, both in the case of the businesses and households. There may appear, the issues of the term nature of the assets and liabilities, and in order to support the banks in their interest towards a longer-term assets, including the government securities, not only the government ones. Yes, we do allow for the extension of the repo period, and we are currently debating it. Elvira Nabiullina, Bloomberg. On March 30th, the Bank of Russia announced that it is stopping to buy, gold into its FX reserves. Could you explain the rationale behind this? Have any view towards the risk in this position on the part of the regulator change? Do you consider the possibility to start selling the gold reserve? We indeed quite actively have been growing the share of gold in the gold and currency reserves in order to diversify gold and foreign currency reserve, because gold is a unique reserve asset. I mentioned it, which doesn't depend upon what the reserve currency countries do, and in order to diversify the risks that not only have the financial nature in them, but also geopolitical one, we were growing the share of gold. It is currently at a comfortable level, and we do not believe it is necessary to start selling our gold reserve. What for? Because we've got enough FX, and in terms of all indicators of what describes our gold and precious metals and currency reserves, it's enough for us to support the imports, and in relation to the short-term debt, basically anything. So to sell gold, we don't see the need. And why we stopped buying gold? Currently, gold is very much in demand in the global market, and this may lead to the export revenue growing, as well as the inflow of hard currency into the Russian market. So what we see is that the gold exporters are making the most out of it right now. Now, in terms of the risk in the gold position, no, that hasn't changed. We do understand that gold is quite a volatile asset, but nevertheless, it carries within some other advantages, which I've mentioned previously. Ivan Schligen, Financial One. Quarantine and government measures for people's self-isolations are becoming tougher. When based on central banks' expectations, the economy may be unfreezing, and how much time will be required in order to catch up on the GDP losses within this period? How many people do you believe will end up being unemployed, and how that will affect inflation and the ruble exchange rate towards the end of this year? Well, several questions in one. Now, the way the restrictive measures are going to be lifted and how gradually the economy is going to recover and go back into the normal situation, in many ways will depend upon how the pandemic is going to evolve. That is the priority, and the restrictive measures, we're very well aware, were not adopted for nothing, but rather to effectively curb the dissemination of coronavirus. In our baseline scenario, what we act upon is that a gradual coming out of the restrictive measures is not going to be even throughout the whole country. It will be taking place in the second quarter. That is our baseline scenario, but it would all depend upon how the situation develops. And it is true that time will be required in order for the economy to recover. That won't happen overnight. There will be various secondary effects that would manifest themselves. In our mind, such a recovery will be occurring gradually. A positive pace of the economic growth will be around in 2021, and the economy within that period will be recovering itself. How many people do you believe will end up being unemployed, and how that may affect inflation in the ruble rate? We have a certain peculiarity in our economy because usually, in as far as the problematic situations in the economy are concerned, different kind of shocks, the labor market is adjusting not by growing unemployment, although certain unemployment growth is happening, but from the historical local low level it may happen by way of adjusting the wages. In many other countries, in the United States, particularly in the United States, I should say, the European Union, it largely reflects itself upon the unemployment as an indicator. In our environment, it reflects upon the wage and salary dynamics, and from this viewpoint, I do not see this in any particular way impacting the ruble exchange rate, although the ruble exchange rate is susceptible to it, but in terms of inflation, we do see quite a strong impact from the disinflationary factors as the result of the decline in the external and domestic demand. And definitely we feel that inflation, because of it, won't move into the area above the target level. Now, Elena Fabricne, Reuters. What is the budget deficit that you have in the baseline forecast by central bank for 2020? What are the risks that the central bank sees in that all of the investment spending by the budget in the current environment could be reallocated into social security requirements? Without doubt, the current environment will impact the budget. The budget confronts considerable reduction in the oil and gas revenues, as well as a considerable reduction in non-oil and gas-related revenue. And during this time, the spending increases, which is required for anti-crisis measures, and that would bring about a greater budget deficit, somewhere around 6%, maybe, I would say, within the 6% margin. But I would like to say that there has been a very weighted, very diligent macroeconomic policy in the country, which enabled us to establish certain buffers and cushions, as well as the National Welfare Fund. Similar kind of buffers can be found in the financial system, and all of this together would enable to, support the social security spending from the budget against such a serious decline in incomes. And if all of the investment spending within the current environment will be reallocated into the social security requirements, what kind of risk would we see? Yes, we do quite possibly see that some of the investment spending, which is impossible to do because there are restrictive measures, some of the entities have stopped operating, and that could be redirected towards the social security area, which will support people in this dire straits, and eventually will make it possible to gradually exit the period of restrictive measures and gradually will recover investments, because we do see that this year investments will fall, which is quite natural in the current environment. And in terms of any special risks, we do not see, and we expect that with the extension of the planning horizon, with the greater predictability, and with the recovery of the financial flows, the investment activity would also recover. And we do know that the government will be supporting the most important investment spending in order for various industries and companies in the sectors to continue functioning. Anton Galkov, Komsomolskaya Pravda newspaper from the city of Saratov. Why? In the end of 2014, during the drastic spike of the dollar exchange rate, the Bank of Russia decided to raise the key rate up to 17%. And nowadays, when the dollar exchange rate also grows, the regulator continues to further reduce the key rate. despite the fact that these are two different crises, wasn't it a mistake, and consequently you reconsidered your policy? And why didn't you reduce the key rate sooner, let's say half a year ago? Because right now this definitely should help the economy. Before it didn't. Well, first off, we didn't reconsider our policy approaches because the situation right now is dramatically different from what it was in 2014. Because our exchange rate is a floating one right now, and we do not the kind of inflationary, disinflationary risks, and the inflationary expectations are more anchored compared to what it was in 2014 and 15. So to react to this situation right now, particularly, which was then related to the risks to our financial stability. So currently there is no need like this whatsoever. And that is why we, on the contrary, do see a space further to reduce and potential to reduce our monetary policy. Why we didn't reduce it half a year ago at the same pace? Well, but tell me, please, half a year ago, could anybody imagine that this will be the turn of events we will face with this pandemic, creating such an impact upon the global economy? And Russia, yes, half a year ago, we reduced the key rate, but not at the kind of speed which currently may be required once we already ascertain considerable decline in demand. And so we believe that the rate will be more effective once the economy gradually moves out from under the restrictive measures. Now, next. Max Seddon from FT. Yesterday, during the meeting about the banking sector, the President and some of the attendees expressed additional suggestions about how the economy could be supported, including the expansion of the government spending through the acquisition by the banks of the new government debt. Does the central bank support such measures? Well, indeed, the banks do have the possibility to additionally buy the government securities, and as often is the case in such difficult conditions, the banks prefer less risk-wrought assets, and they run into the risk-free assets, and with this regard, the government debt in the eyes of the banks is attractive, and so this is quite a possible development. Tatiana Chubasova from Interfax. Does the central bank consider the possibility of establishing the negative value of the anti-cyclical markup? Well, we do not, because legally we don't have such an opportunity, and I'm not aware that anywhere in the world the anti-cyclical negative markup is, because anti-cyclical markup works in the following way. On the contrary, it is set at a certain level during the good times, so that one could resort to it during the difficult times, somehow unfold this buffer. And so that is why many countries establish such anti-cyclical marks at the higher levels in order to be able to use them later on. So our anti-cyclical markup is at a zero level, and there is no possibility, and there is no need to reduce this. We have other buffers which we may be made effective macroprudential, and actually we already started doing it as far as the mortgage market is concerned, for the amount of about 110 billion rubles, and there are other buffers, and so as the need arises, we will be able to use them. Apart from it, we allow the banks not to adhere to certain markups on top of the adequacy standards, as long as they conform to the dividends and bonuses requirements. Roman Kerov, Russian Gazette. What will happen to consumer lending once the economy recovers? How strongly the bank's loan portfolio will deplete? Is it possible to talk about multiples in terms of the reduction in various forms of lending? What the central bank may do about it? Well, without doubt, in such a complex set of circumstances, usually the lending subsides. The question here is about the consumer lending, but we believe it will behave itself slightly differently than in the case of the corporate lending, because we do see a bit of an extension of the growth in the corporate lending, which in many ways can be explained by the fact that major corporates, they come from the external market and they go to the banks for the lending, and they come from the bond market as well. But the household demand under such conditions for the loans goes down, and the banks are more cautious in currently assessing the credit risks in terms of the multiple reduction of lending activity nowadays, as well as after we recover from the, we do not see it. So overall, based on our assessment, the consumer lending will be about 0%, I suppose, maybe a little bit in the red, but the mortgage, we believe, is going to grow. On our expectations, about 80% this year. This is certainly lower, twice as much as it was last year, but it will grow due to, amongst other things, the measures set forth by the government in subsidizing mortgage at the level of 6.5%. So consumer lending, as we expect, will nevertheless fall by about 2%, maybe even more, and maybe even more, I should say. So we're currently really seeing this wide intervals in between 5 to 0. The auto loans may fall down about 5% because we see that the auto lending is not developing. Now, support for the lending will come from our regulatory easing and the loan restructuring. The restructuring of the loans, that will rather help to the individuals and businesses to quicker recover their credit worthiness as the economy opens up, as it moves from under the restrictive measures, and this in the future may allow for the overall lending activity in the economy to spring. Margarita Spilewska from TASS. Those who protect the rights of the borrowers acknowledge an avalanche of the complaints from the households who cannot get the credit holidays. Does the CB ascertain this problem as well? What is the explanation behind the refusals? And what is the kind of the solution that the central bank can see here? You know, it is true that we do acknowledge that there are refusals, and people not always are able to get the restructuring of their loans when they go to the banks. And there are several reasons to it. First of all, there is a big inflow immediately, at one time, of these applications for financial restructuring. The banks are saying that it's several times more within 1 month than throughout the whole year, previous year. And certainly the banks are trying to fine-tune the system by simultaneously. They are fine-tuning of the restructuring mechanisms that they need to put into place. And we do see that the dynamics of approving such applications is positive. Now, the reasons behind the refusals, the most significant one, is because the criteria for restructurings are not being met according to the law, whereby the banks are obliged to restructure this loan if the applicant meets the criteria. And many refusals are because the amount of loan is greater than what was set in the regulatory documents. And I suppose basically these are the main reasons. We have a call center and the Consumer Rights Protection Agency, so we will definitely be monitoring it, but we do see that the banks currently have become more active in turning around to face the households and the businesses, and because for everybody, the timeliness of such a restructuring is very important so as to be able to avoid the fines and penalties. And one must really say that the banks are seriously taking up the efforts to reorganize themselves, understanding that in many ways this will help to support the credit standing of their future borrowers and their future customers. Anna Kaligina from Izvestia. Why the banks are so reluctant in giving loans at 0% to have businesses pay wages? Isn't this the reason behind this being a highly risky credit? Maybe the conditions here should be somehow adjusted. No, it is correct. Both the government and ourselves, when that program was being launched, that the deployment of it, in terms of its pace, was very low, not very effective. And so we were concerned by it. And together with the banks, we were working on how to improve it so that the banks could easier define the amount of loan to be made available. So all of the tools and mechanisms that were put into place will enable us to see this lending dynamics become stronger, and which also could be assisted by growing the amount of the guaranteed coverage by the VEB bank. Currently it is about 70%, 25% remains as the risk toll for the banks against the uncertainty, when it is difficult to conduct a very proper and correct estimate and assessment of what kind of a company, to what extent will be able to recover its credit worthiness. And the banks definitely are refraining from taking too much of a credit risk so as not to accumulate on their balances stressed assets. So it will be very much important to enjoy such support, as well as be able to have a stronger VEB banks assistance. Then very few banks were originally working in this program, because we always stated that the program should encompass a greater number of banks, not only systemically significant banks, not only leading banks, but also the banks which have a good credit quality. So the pledge-free loans, in the case of the banks who are ready to support these government programs, which allows for a greater number of banks who can. There are about 64 banks, if my memory serves me right. But we do see that the number of banks is growing right now. There are more than 30 of them which are in this program. So we will act on the assumption that the program will further develop. There is a certain tangible demand for it, so we'll continuously monitor it and reflect it within the financial pulse that we publish. Anton Feinberg, Rybka. When do you think the Russian economy will recover back to the pre-crisis level? Well, speaking about the quarterly rates, I mentioned that we expect in the third quarter that the recovery may start, which will continue also through 2021. But within one quarter period, neither the global nor the Russian economy will be able to rebound back to its pre-pandemic state. Therefore, the annual rates of growth will remain negative until the first quarter of 2021. And this is the period that we believe is when it will be recovering back to its pre-crisis normality. The next question comes from one of our subscribers in one of the social medias. During the previous press conference, you said that the banks will extend the deadlines for the expiring cards. My own bank is saying that it doesn't have a technical capacity to do that, and the card could be reissued, and it will be available in the electronic form, which will make it possible to use it to pay online, but not withdraw cash, as well as do transactions for which specifically the physical card is necessary. How can you comment this? Yes, indeed, we issued such guidelines, and we know that the payment systems which work within the Russian markets, in their rules, they do envisage the possibility of transacting using these cards, the ones that have expired. Moreover, they have also given their guidelines and recommendations to the banks, and the technical capacity to reorganize this process, and the banks need to do that in order to enjoy such a possibility. It is available, and many banks have already done so, because this is the amount of work they need to do, but some require more time, and we will watch over the way things develop. We will be giving to the banks various explanations, and there's any need in terms of what kind of procedures they should follow, and we believe it to be principally important for people to have this ability once the restrictive measures are in place. If your problems are not resolved, please get in touch with our internet reception office, and in terms of any specific case, we would be happy to get engaged. And at the same time, I would like to note that we do see how the non-cash payments in terms of their volume is growing, which is basically very much sought after, by the people who want to use non-cash basis payment. Dmitry Sannikov, representative from Vladivostok, because of the pandemic, the number of fraud cases increases related to the banking card. How the credit institutions do combat these illegal activities? What are the schemings which are most popular amongst the fraudsters? Well, the fraud experts will always be very ingenious and would always make the most out of the difficult situation that normal people find themselves in. We do register that there is a growing frequency of dubious phone calls coming to people with reference made to the government agencies and various suggestions of dubious nature with credit holidays. So the banks are saying it. When somebody is calling you and trying over the phone, asking you for your personal information, don't talk. Simply hang up and call the bank or the financial institutions that is serving you. Under no circumstances mention your personal data or the information of your banking card. As soon as somebody is asking for your information like that, hang up and just, get in touch directly with your real bank. And the last question looks like it comes from Ekaterina Litova from Vedomosti, and Tatiana Voronova from Reuters, and Natalia Ivankina from Rambla. Is banking crisis possible? Immediately, I would say no, it is not possible. May the banks require support this year? What one should do in order for the banks not to accumulate bad debts, something that the President yesterday spoke about during the meeting. Without doubt, the current environment reflects upon the banks. The quality of assets diminishes. Many, both households and businesses, are restructuring their loans, and that basically translates into the banks falling short of their revenue and income. But I would like to underscore this situation is dramatically different from what we had in 2008, 2009, because the banks currently have in their possession real reserve of capital and liquidity, and they have approached the current difficulties in a much more prepared way. And at the same time, we are providing them with the regulatory easing so that irrespective of various cushions and cushions of the capital nature, the banks could extend these losses over time, because inevitably that will happen. And so what is the need for this capital? Why we have established this macroprudential markups, although the banks definitely haven't expressed satisfaction, rather dissatisfaction with this buffer, because the capital buffers is currently about 5 trillion. And this capital buffers, the so-called buffers, are necessary in order for the banks to absorb losses from the restructuring, from somebody not being able to repay the loan, or for the fact that the quality of the assets is going down. And under such circumstances, this is something that definitely should be used. And again, our regulation enables one to extend these losses over time. We run stress testing regularly, and we see that despite the significant fall in the incomes, the banks still have capital. They can do restructuring. They may continue to lend to the economy. But this is the situation in the current point in time. It is important to see how the economy will develop and what is the health. How do the borrowers are faring, the bank borrowers? Because we always are trying to monitor whether there are any stressed assets on the balances. So specifically, the measures to support borrowers are necessary so as to avoid the too much of the bad asset accumulation, so that the banks could retain the trust from their customers. That's exactly what is happening right now. Thank you very much. The question list is exhausted. I'm grateful to you for your questions. Let me remind you that we are publishing the Financial Pulse Bulletin every week, giving a more detailed story. Today, after 6 p.m., it will be released. And because the next Friday is a day off, we plan another press conference to hold on May 8th, because that is when our next Financial Powers Bulletin is going to be published. And in case we feel it is necessary, we shall discuss additional measures, and if need be, we will announce it before May 8th if there's a need to. But otherwise, I would like to wish everyone health and to stay home. Thank you very much for your attention.